Alright, y'all, so we are back here to look at part 2 of chapter 17, so let's get going with it. Alright, so last time we left off, we were talking about the draft, and one thing, I was talking about how, like, it's really a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Something else to keep in mind, y'all, is that the draft is going to appear both in North and the South. And in the North, you could actually pay to get out of the war, but you had to pay $300. So, pretty hefty price tag, just when you think about it. But understand, both the North and the South ultimately hated the draft. Okay, now, let's talk about a couple things, y'all. When we talk about war, we talk about theaters, right? The theater is where the action happens. I've kind of talked to you about that before, but we first look at the Western Theater. This is going to be from the Appalachian Mountains out to the Mississippi River. Okay. The Western Theater, is where the fighting occurred while the armies built up. Again, it takes a while for the armies in the East to really build up, but we do see some people out west who do have some military, who do have some army. Again, some people have been stationed out west since ultimately the Mexican War, right? So this is where the fighting occurred while the armies built up back east. The Southern general was Albert Sidney Johnston, and he was good, but he didn't have enough men to cover his area. Again, y'all, when I talk about good, we're talking about military leadership here, not necessarily moralistic principles. But Johnston was good, but he didn't have enough men to cover his area. The Union was led by U.S. Grant. Grant didn't have a good reputation at this time. He was known as a drunk. He had resigned earlier, like before the Civil War even started. He had resigned after the Mexican War, and now he's coming back into service. So he was known as a drunk. He had resigned earlier. He had finished in the bottom half of his West Point class, but he was effective early on. He attacked and took Fort Henry and Fort Donelson from the south. So Johnson doesn't have enough men to do. Johnson's really good, but he doesn't have enough men. I guess the way I would think about it, y'all, is imagine if we were, go back to when we were in class in that room in Peltier Hall, right? So that room in Peltier had 3 exterior doors, right? There were the 2 doors, and then there was that one in the back of the classroom that actually connected to another one, right? Well, imagine if it's just me and one other person left to guard that room, right? How do we adequately defend? Or maybe it's just me left to defend that room, right? I can only do so much. I can only prepare and I can only protect so much. Well, that's the situation that A.S. Johnston is going through. Now, Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant, he will obviously become a famous general later on. He will earn the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. But here, Ulysses S. Grant doesn't have a good reputation at the beginning of the war, but he's effective. He's doing well early on. Now that brings us to the Battle of Shiloh. Okay? I actually got to visit there earlier over the semester break back in January. Yeah, it was a huge battlefield. If you ever get a chance, I recommend, give yourself definitely several hours, maybe even an entire day to spend some time there, because it's really interesting. But nonetheless, y'all, we look at the Battle of Shiloh. Okay, so Grant is moving south, but he made a huge mistake and he put his troops in a bad spot. Okay, so here we are. Grant is moving south. He takes Fort Henry. He takes Fort Donelson. Now he's looking to take Shiloh. So Grant was moving south, but made a huge mistake and put his troops in a bad spot. Now the Confederate A.S. Johnston attacks, and they demolish the Union forces. But Johnston is killed in the battle. And so the Confederates fall back before they get a total surrender of the Union. So the Confederates attack. They are awesome. They decimate the Union forces. But A.S. Johnston is killed in the battle. Okay? When he dies in the battle, his people are like, oh man, what do we do? Our leader just died. Okay, let's take a step back. Let's regroup. They don't force Grant. They don't force the Union to surrender. Again, I told you after First Bull Run, we see that same thing happening here. Okay, so the Confederates fall back before they get a total surrender. The next day, U.S. Grant and his aide, William Tecumseh Sherman, W.T. Sherman, respond with their own attack. They had gotten some reinforcements overnight. They attack with, or they respond with their own attack. and they forced the South to retreat to Corinth, Mississippi. Understand, y'all, Shiloh, Tennessee is really pretty much on the border of Tennessee and of southwestern Tennessee and northern Mississippi. So what you're seeing here is that the Confederates attack Grant on day one and do great, but Johnston dies. Well, now here on day two, Grant attacks back and forces the Confederates to retreat. They retreat back to Corinth, Mississippi. Okay? Now, when we look at this, the Union was also too weak to push ahead and get a total surrender. While Grant came back and won, his screw-up was so costly, his superiors, not Lincoln, his military superiors, took him out of power, so the Union effort stalled for a while in the West. So what we're seeing is that the Union has some miscues that leads to Confederate victory. But the next day, the Union has a victory, but even though he overcomes this really, really bad mistake and ultimately wins the battle, Grant's superiors still see him as a failure in this regard, and they remove him from power. Now, when we look at some of the lasting effects of Shiloh, y'all, Shiloh was a big battle, and it reaffirmed that it was going to be a long and costly war. Okay? The total casualties just from Shiloh, y'all, just from this one 2-day battle, total casualties were around 20,000. Y'all, that was more than the Mexican War had altogether. Here we have 20,000 casualties, roughly 20,000 casualties in one 2-day battle. It reaffirms that this is going to be a big war, and it's going to be very costly when it comes to the toll it takes on human lives. Okay. Now let's look at the Eastern Theater. So, y'all, our Western Theater kind of stalls. Nothing really happens because Grant was the one who was making stuff happen, and he gets removed from power. Again, he overcomes his big mistake, but the leadership, the military leadership, says, "No, you're not in control anymore." Okay, and so things kind of stall. Things are at a standstill over in the West. Now, when we look at the East, y'all, Lincoln now thinks he has the right guy. Lincoln's going to spend a lot of the war trying to find the right general to lead his army in the East. He spends a lot of time on that, and it's going to take a long time before he gets the guy he wants. But here, Lincoln thinks he has the right guy to lead the war. He has George McClellan. McClellan is loved by his men. He's a great trainer and organizer. But he's not good at actually attacking. Like, he's really good at training men. He's good. He's loved by the men. But he's not actually really good at attacking. That's kind of a big deal if you want to win a war, right? So let's look at it. He's not good at actually attacking. That's going to lead to some problems. Over time, Lincoln and McClellan are going to grow to almost be enemies. So again, he's going to develop a bad relationship with Lincoln, even to the point of, I don't remember which one, I don't remember off the top of my head, y'all, but their relationship gets so bad to, at one point in time, one of them calls the other a baboon. Y'all, like, if you're calling a baboon, y'all think about it. If one of the leading American generals is calling the president a baboon, or the president is calling one of the leading American generals a baboon, that's not a good situation no matter what. No matter who's doing the name calling. It goes to show that relationship is not great. Now, the Union under McClellan wanted to take Richmond, so they initiate what we call the Peninsula Campaign. Okay, this little area up around Richmond, kind of a little bit of a peninsula. Okay, so under McClellan, the Union wanted to take Richmond, so we get the Peninsula Campaign. We have several battles. Battle of Seven Pines. Okay, what we see is that the big thing I want you to know about Seven Pines is that Joseph Johnston was wounded for the Confederates, and this is where Robert E. Lee takes over. So at the Battle of Seven Pines, this is where Robert E. Lee takes over in the East for the Confederates. Then we get the 7 Days Battle. This battle had 30,000 combined casualties. McClellan was winning, but retreated, and Robert E. Lee saves Richmond. Lincoln will continue to be upset with McClellan. So what we see happening here, y'all, is that, again, the big thing about McClellan, y'all, is that he almost tried to plan too much. He wanted to do everything perfect before he attacked. And sometimes you can't wait for that. He waits and waits and waits for the perfect moment to attack. And the reality is that by the time the perfect moment comes, if you're not already attacking, that perfect moment will have passed you by. And so what we see is that Seven Pines, ultimately Robert E. Lee rises up for the Confederates, and he will take control of the Confederate Army in the East. In the 7 days battle, 30,000 combined casualties, and ultimately the Union is winning and winning and winning. And then McClellan says, you know what? I don't want to get too far. I don't want to get too far ahead of my supplies. I want to take my time. I want to do this the right way. So instead of just pushing on and taking Richmond, which he probably could have done, he stops and he waits for reinforcements. What that does is it lets Robert E. Lee retreat and ultimately regroup and retain control of Richmond. Okay? Now, that brings us to the Second Battle of Bull Run. McClellan is told to unite with other Union leader John Pope and be second in command. So Lincoln is really, really not happy with what McClellan did there at the 7 days battle. So he says, look, McClellan, you link up with John Pope, but Pope is in control. Okay? And you were supposed to attack Richmond. Remember, y'all, that was part of the Anaconda plan, right? Protect DC, defend DC, take Richmond. Defend DC, take Richmond. So that's what they're trying to do here. So McClellan is told to unite with other Union leader John Pope and be second in command and to attack Richmond. But before they can do that, Robert E. Lee attacks Pope. The Confederates actually stole Pope's uniform and war plans before the battle and were able to set a trap for the Union. So Lincoln thinks McClellan's going to be good. McClellan fails. Now he brings in Pope. Pope has his uniform and his war plan stolen. So Robert E. Lee knows exactly what they're going to do. They're able to set a trap for the Union. And, obviously, if they know what the Union's going to do and they set a trap for them, the Confederates are going to win easy. Now McClellan is back in total command. Okay? So now McClellan is in total command again. So this brings us to Antietam. Antietam will be a turning point in the war. Antietam here is a turning point in the war. So let's look at it. Lee now decides to invade the North. He wanted to go on the offensive and gain international support. So Robert E. Lee gets to the point where he says, look, let's stop waiting to be attacked. Let's go on the offensive. Let's attack into the North. Okay? So at Antietam, Lee decides to invade the North. He wanted to go on the offensive and gain international support. See, he's thinking, if we attack into the North and we win, maybe other countries around the world will see we're really serious and we can really do this. We're not just here protecting ourselves. We can launch an offensive war. But while heading north, his war plans were lost. While heading north, Lee's war plans were lost and found by the Union. So McClellan has Lee's war plans. McClellan knows what Lee is going to do. But again, McClellan waited too long before he attacked because he was always overly cautious. Again, he's waiting for the perfect moment. He's waiting for everything to be just right. He has Lee's plans. He knows what Lee's going to do. But he continues and waits. Now, this gave Lee time to still get set up, and because of that, it was one of the largest one-day battles. Antietam is one of the largest one-day battles. Now, ultimately, what we're going to see is that Lee has his plan. McClellan knows what he's about to do, and when both sides know what the other side's going to do, it's going to get pretty rough. It's going to get pretty nasty. And again, it's one of the largest one-day battles. McClellan and the Union attacked, but let off late in the day. Now Lee and the Confederates retreat. It's pretty much a stalemate strategically, but it was a huge loss for the South. Now England and France say they will not support the Confederates. So just to kind of give you an idea, trying to think of how I can do this. I'll just do it like this. So, if I'm going to do this right here, give me just a second, y'all. Alright, so, let me see if I can pull this up. So we have Antietam, right? Let's say that's the border between the North and the South, or between the North and the South. What Lee does is Lee invades the North. McClellan knows what Lee is going to do, so he's waiting for him, and they get into a big fight. Well, what happens is that Lee retreats. He comes back below the border. Did he lose any land? No, he didn't. Strategically, it's a stalemate. Lee just went back to where he was before the battle. Now, why is that important? I'll show you, and we'll talk about it in just a minute. Okay? So, with that being said, let me go back to where my notes are. Try to figure this out. Alright, so, again, Lee's war plans were lost and found by the Union, but again, McClellan waited too long to attack because he's overly cautious. This gave Lee still time to get set up before the battle, so a huge one-day battle. What we see is that now England and France say they will not support the Confederates. Also, Lincoln is upset with McClellan for easing up, so he replaces them. McClellan could have invaded into the South and tried to conquer and try to force Lee to surrender, but he doesn't. Again, a constant theme throughout the Civil War is that both sides never delivered the knockout punch when they had the opportunity. Now, so Lincoln is upset with McClellan for easing up, and so he replaces him again. Now we get General Ambrose Burnside. We'll talk more about Burnside at our next battle at Fredericksburg. Now, while Lincoln is upset and the battle was only a strategic stalemate, Lincoln claims a victory because Lee retreated, and he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Y'all, think about it. To this point in time, what has the Union won? Union really hasn't done much. Okay, they took New Orleans, they took Baton Rouge, they had a little bit of victory with their Navy. On the battlefield, who's really winning? You can maybe say that Grant won, but then he was removed from power, and what did he really win? Right? Over in the East, what's happened? McClellan wins and loses, Pope loses his war plans, right? Even at Antietam, even where McClellan had Lee's war plans, he doesn't do what? He doesn't get a total victory. He just fights it back to where it was before. Remember, Lee retreated, but all he really did was go back to his own little area. Y'all, think about it in these terms. You wanted to have two desks in class. The person in front of you isn't there, so you try to put your feet up on the desk in front of you. Well, that person walks in halfway through class. What do? You take your feet down and they sit in their desk. Have you really lost anything? Did you lose anything you didn't have before class started? No, before class started, when you expected that person to be there, they were going to sit in that desk and you didn't have it. Well, here, after class is over, you still didn't have it. So nobody really won. Nobody took anything away from the other. But Lincoln calls it a victory. Lincoln claims victory here at Antietam because he says that Lee retreated. From a military standpoint, y'all, it's no big deal. But from a political standpoint, from a public relations standpoint, in essence, from a media standpoint, it's a huge deal. He claims a victory because Lee retreated, and Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Y'all, if I actually tell me about the Emancipation Proclamation, you will probably tell me this. It freed all the slaves. But did it? Did it really? Let's look at it, y'all. The Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves in rebellious states. Not everywhere. And would become effective January 1st, 1863. Okay, so let's look at a couple things. First of all, y'all, Antietam, we're looking end of 1862, so we're looking September-ish. 1862 is when we're talking about Antietam. So we're not gonna free slaves for a few more months. And then secondly, free slaves in all rebellious states. Did every slave-owning state rebel? No. So if you were a slave in West Virginia, you're a slave in Delaware, were you free? No, you weren't. Right? It was going to free slaves in all rebellious states. But also, let's think about that, y'all. So, freeing slaves in rebellious states, like, say, Mississippi. Yo, did the people of Mississippi believe that Lincoln was their president? No, they believed they seceded and created a different nation. So did the Emancipation Proclamation actually free those people? Or those people in Mississippi listening to Lincoln? No. Now, what about a place like Baton Rouge or New Orleans, where the Union Army had conquered those cities? Then yes, those places would be. So what I'm trying to say, y'all, is that the Emancipation Proclamation is a big media thing. And I use media in a loose sense because their media and our media is vastly different. But yeah, it was a public relations coup d'etat. It was an incredible thing for Lincoln to do here. And now, no matter what, no matter where you stood on any issue before, now the war is about ending slavery. Remember, when Lincoln took office, he had no intention of ending slavery where it existed. What he wants to do is stop it from spreading, and he wants to stop the South from seceding. Well, now, a couple years in, he's like, okay, how are we going to end this war? The only way we're going to end secession is if the Union wins the war. How is the Union going to win the war? Ultimately, by ending slavery. That is, now the war becomes about ending slavery. If it wasn't before, if there's any doubt, now, after the Emancipation Proclamation, it is totally about ending slavery. So, freed all slaves in rebellious states, not everywhere. It would become effective January 1st, 1863. Now the war is a moral war, and no other reasons really matter. Now, until this point, Lincoln only cared about restoring the Union. But he needed something to help boost morale. Again, to this point in time, what has the Union won? Not much. So here we are at the end of 1862, and this war's been going on for a year and a half, almost 2 years, and the North really doesn't have much to show. He needed something to boost American morale. It was not welcomed by all, but it did enough for Lincoln. Okay, it wasn't welcomed by all, but ultimately it did enough for Lincoln. So again, not to beat a dead horse on this one, y'all, but the Emancipation Proclamation, at that moment, did it free a whole bunch of slaves? No, it didn't. Okay? But what did it do? It made the war a moral war. It made the war about slavery. And what did it really get accomplished? It got everybody who was against slavery on the side of the North, everybody who was for slavery on the side of the South. Okay? So slaves who hear about this, they want to join the Union Army. They want to help out. Everything, any other issue that might have been in play falls by the wayside, and this becomes about war. And now here Lincoln takes something that was really just a stalemate and calls it a victory, and then that's going to lead to victories for him later on down the war. Okay? Now let's take a look at Fredericksburg. In December of 1862, Burnside and the Union attacked the Confederates, who were well stationed by Lee, and the Union is decimated as they charged the Confederate line 6 times. Okay? Over 12,000 Union casualties, and the South had less than 6,000. So y'all here at Fredericksburg, Ambrose Burnside, who's going to take over after McClellan's second screw up and everything. Ambrose. In December of 1862, Ambrose Burnside and the Union attacked the Confederates, who were well stationed by Lee. The Union's going to be decimated. They charged the Confederate line 6 times, and the Confederates had like half as many casualties. The Union had over 12,000. The Confederates had less than 6,000. So now at the end of 1862, we are back where we started in the East, and the West has been at a standstill since U.S. Grant was removed. But with January comes the start of the Emancipation Proclamation. So as we finish up 1862, what has really changed? Not much. Everything in the East is still the way it was. The stuff in the West hasn't changed since Grant was removed from power. But beginning in January, as we move into January 1863, the Union has hope. Why? Because the Emancipation Proclamation is going to go into effect, and they are expecting slaves and everybody to really start to kind of help them out. Okay? Now, let's look at it. With the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks swelled to the Union Army, but it took a while before they were accepted because the North had just as many racists as the South. They just didn't want slavery to spread to the rest of the country. Okay, so remember that, y'all. The North was not immune to racism. The North had racists, just as many as the South. It's just that their racism existed and was used in a different way, right? They didn't want to see slavery. They didn't want African Americans moving up north. They wanted to get rid of slavery in the South so that African Americans would stay in the South, so that African Americans wouldn't move out west. Remember, they wanted free soil for free people and all these different things. So we see a lot of different attitudes. Just understand that the North, while the North fought to end slavery, they didn't always fight for the right reasons, and that's something we have to keep in mind. That the North did have many races as well. So with the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks swelled to the Union Army, but it took a while before they were accepted because the North had just as many races as the South. They just didn't want slavery to spread to the rest of the country. But eventually, the blacks get involved and make up about 10% of the Union Army. They will get involved. They will make up about 10% of the Union Army. But think about that. African Americans who want to join up and sign up and fight for the Union Army, who want to help bring about an end to slavery, often were denied or weren't given, definitely didn't see equality within the Army. We look at women, y'all. Women in the war played an important role in both the North and the South. They made uniforms, raised money and supplies. They became nurses. They helped the freed slaves. Also, now women had to take over all of the family businesses. So women are really getting involved here in this war. It's not just men that are impacted, but women across the nation in both the North and the South. Okay, so let's get some more war. Okay, Chancellorsville. Okay, now Lincoln replaces Burnside with Joseph Hooker. Again, Burnside wasn't successful, so Lincoln replaces him with Joseph Hooker as the leader of the Union, and it's a 130,000 man army. So Joseph Hooker is leading 130,000 men in the U.S. Army. Robert E. Lee and the Confederates had about half that. But with Lee's great strategy, they beat the Union and forced Hooker to retreat. But while it was a victory, it had its price. The Confederates lost Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who was Lee's best aide. This was also Lee's last major victory. So here we are at Chancellorsville. It's a victory for the Confederates, but it's going to be Lee's last major victory. And part of that is that Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who was Lee's top assistant, is going to die in the battle. So Hooker loses here. Again, y'all, think about all the different leaders Lincoln has gone through. McClellan, we're going to have McClellan, we're going to have Burnside, we're going to have Polk, Hooker, all these different people, and Lincoln still can't get anybody to give him the victory that he really wants. Again, but this victory did have a cost for the Southerners. Lee's last major victory, and ultimately Stonewall Jackson's death really hurts. That brings us to Vicksburg. Now, U.S. Grant is back in charge in the West. Finally, somebody says, hey, let's put Grant in charge in the West. Things weren't going well. Things weren't going well in the West, but they finally say, let's put Grant back. At least Grant was getting something done. So U.S. Grant is back in charge in the West and now moving south again. He spent months trying to figure out how to beat Vicksburg, Mississippi, right? It had great defenses. It was surrounded by bayous and marsh and waterways. So Vicksburg is at this point in Mississippi that is strategically really, really hard to beat, okay? Finally, Grant was able to encircle it, and he hoped to starve them into submission. So finally, Grant is able to surround Vicksburg and try to starve them into submission. The people of Vicksburg hid in caves because of the bombing, and eventually had to resort to eating rodents to survive because they were trapped. So y'all, it's not just Fort Vicksburg, it's the entire city of Vicksburg, and they are surrounded. They are under siege. Whenever possible, Grant is bombing them, shooting cannons into the city. They're completely surrounded. Some of the people are resorting to living in caves because of the bombing. And then secondly, they run out of food. They're like, nobody can get in or out of the city unless Grant wants them to. And this is going to go on for quite some time. And these people are going to start to run out of food. Get to the point where, like, even if there might be food in the city, maybe they can't get to it safely. They're scared that they're going to get hit by. They resort to living in caves and eating rodents. And yes, I do mean rats. Okay? And we'll come back to that. That's not everything for Vicksburg, but we'll come back to it. So now we look at Gettysburg. To try and save Vicksburg, and ultimately win the war, to try and save Vicksburg, Lee decides to attack north again. Basically, Lee is deciding, I'm going to attack north into the Union. And what's that going to do? If I attack north into the Union and I win, well then Grant would have to leave take some people away from Vicksburg down here. If I attack up here, Grant would have to take some people away from Vicksburg, and that would help Vicksburg maybe break free, right? That's the thought. Attack into the north that pulls some of Grant's troops to the north to fight against Lee, and that would free up Vicksburg, okay? So to try and save Vicksburg, Lee decides to attack north again. Grant would have to send help to the north, okay? Neither the north or the south picked Gettysburg. It's just kind of where they met up. Neither side is really stationed on either end of Gettysburg. It's just that's where they ended up at. So on July 1st, 1863, the Confederates attacked and pushed the Union soldiers back. Unfortunately, they push him into the best position available on the high ground. Now, the new Union leader George Meade held strong, and on July 3rd, 1863, Lee ordered one last great attack, led by George Pickett, known as Pickett's Charge. It was a direct attack to the heart of the Union, and it was a disaster. Most of the men in the charge were wounded. Okay? So what we see is that Lee is doing really well. George Meade and his men are retreating, but again, y'all, Lincoln has picked yet another general, George Meade. If you're wondering, y'all, George Meade, there used to be a hall named on campus. It was like right next to tennis courts on campus. It was a dorm called Meade Hall, named after George Meade. It was out of use by the time I was a student in the early or in the late 2000s. But it was actually demolished while I was a student here at Nichols. Point that's off subject. Anyway, so George Meade is there at Gettysburg. He meets up with Lee, and Lee is beating him, but beats him right into the perfect spot on the battlefield. And that's where Meade says, no, we're going to hunker down here, we're going to stay, this is a perfect spot. And Lee tries repeatedly, and it fails. And we see Pickett's Charge right at the heart of the Union lines, and it's a failure, y'all. Most of the people who went out on Pickett's Charge were wounded. Okay? And the South lost a third of its army at Gettysburg. Now Lee retreats, but is lucky because Meade doesn't follow and finish him off. Y'all, the Confederates lost a third of their army here. But what does Meade do? Not proceed. Now think about it. Meade was getting his butt kicked until he stayed at that one spot, right? Until he got backed up into higher. He doesn't want to chase after Lee and get caught up in that again and possibly have a role reversal and have him get decimated or his troops get decimated. So again, Lee is able to retreat and not forced to surrender. So the South lost a third of its army at Gettysburg. Now Lee retreats, but is lucky because Meade doesn't follow and finish him off. So Lee lives to fight another day. Then, on July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered after a 47-day siege. So, Lee's attempt to attack Gettysburg to relieve Vicksburg doesn't work, and secondly, it was probably too late because just a day or two after, on July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered after a 47-day siege. For basically a month and a half, for basically as long as we've been quarantined, right? We've been quarantined for close to a month and a half, right? Here, U.S. Grant had the city of Vicksburg surrounded, and finally Vicksburg surrenders. The city surrenders on July 4th, 1863. Interesting little quick tidbit that a lot of people are bitter about the Civil War. A lot of Southerners get bitter about the Civil War and stuff like that. So much so that the city of Vicksburg really doesn't celebrate July 4th for several years, several decades actually. The city of Vicksburg will not celebrate July 4th because they surrendered, because the Confederates surrendered. So it's funny just to kind of see, and it's a level of petty, but it's kind of this interesting thing to see that people in the South were still really upset about losing the war and what happened, what ultimately Grant did to them during Vicksburg, and they won't celebrate the 4th of July like the rest of America for several years. Now, what we see is that several months later in November, a cemetery remembering the dead from Gettysburg was created, and Lincoln gave a short speech, commonly known as the Gettysburg Address, right? So that declared, in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln declared that the U.S. would see, quote, a new birth of freedom. He's saying, we come out here and all of this death is going to lead to a rebirth, a new birth of freedom here in America. We once got a birth of freedom. We once got our freedom from Great Britain. But we're going to experience a new birth of freedom at the end of this. Lincoln's confident in that. So now we look at Chattanooga. The Union fights to get control of the railroad. They defeat the Confederates under Braxton Bragg. The big deal about this is that they took away a lot of the Deep South by conquering Chattanooga. Chattanooga is a big railroad city for the South. And by conquering Chattanooga, they take away a lot of the railroad away from the South. Now, Lincoln finally finds his guy, and he brings U.S. Grant to the East. So, Lincoln finally looks out and says, what has Grant done? The one time he made a mistake, he overcame it, was able to win. I want that guy. Lincoln brings him Lincoln's now going to bring Grant into the east, which means Grant's top aide, William Tecumseh Sherman, is going to be put in charge in the west and in the south. Now, what's really interesting is that again, y'all, Grant has this reputation of not being this great. Grant has a reputation of being a drunk. Well, when people tell that to Lincoln, Lincoln's response is basically, "Well, what's he drink so I can buy a barrel of it for the rest of my generals?" Because obviously, whatever he's drinking makes him great compared to every other general I've hired, I've put in command to this point. Think about it: Hooker, Burnside, Meade, maybe with the no, even Meade. We got Meade, Hooker, Burnside, Pope, McClellan. All of them are failing at what he's doing. What does Lincoln look out and see Grant doing? Win, not stopping, challenging, 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 never stopping. And that's what Lincoln wants. So Lincoln makes Grant the leader in the East to fight against Robert E. Lee, and so that means William Tecumseh Sherman will take charge in the South and in the West. So we'll come back to the fighting in just a moment. But let's look at ending the Confederacy, the plan. Okay, so Grant leaves William Sherman in charge in the South and in the West. In the East, he says, don't focus on Richmond, focus on Lee. He says, make it a total war, ravage everything, but do it quickly. He says there would be less dead and less devastation with 1 year of total war than there would be with another 3 years of prolonged war. He was trying to kill the morale of the South. Y'all, what Grant is saying here is, you are trying to take the city of Richmond. The city of Richmond doesn't represent the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee's army represents the Confederacy. So even if you take Richmond, Robert E. Lee's still going to fight you. So he's saying you have to take Lee. You have to conquer Lee, not the city of Richmond. So he says, don't focus on Richmond, focus on Lee. And then secondly, he says, make it a total war. Destroy and ravage everything, but do it quickly. Very much, y'all, he's saying what? Rip the Band-Aid off, don't peel it back slowly. He's saying, yes, we want to go out, we want total war, destroy everything. If it in any way, shape, or form helps the Confederates in their war effort, destroy it, even if it's personal, private property. Why? Because we want to break their will to fight. What happened when the Americans fought the British in the Revolutionary War? What did we do? We broke their will to fight. They could have kept fighting. They decided they didn't want to, right? That's what we start to see happening here with the South. Grant wants to break their will to fight. 1 year of total war will ultimately result in less dead and less devastation than 3 years of just dragging this out, right? Rip the Band-Aid off. Don't slowly peel it. That's what Grant wants, okay? He's trying to kill the morale of the South. So it brings us to the election of 1864. We get a split in the Democratic Party. Again, we have another split. We saw a split between Northern and Southern Democrats back in 1860. Here we're seeing a split between war and peace Democrats. Remember, y'all, Democrats are pretty big in the South. Okay, so we get a split in the Democratic Party between the peace Democrats, sometimes called Copperheads, and the war Democrats. The war Democrats unite with the Republicans to make the Union Party. The Union Party nominates Abraham Lincoln for president in 1864. Interesting thing here, y'all. Lincoln runs as a Republican, but technically he wins under the Union Party, so he's only a person on a technicality. He's only a person to be elected to the presidency by under two different parties. He's a Republican, no questions about it. But because some war Democrats joined with him, they adopted a new name called the Union Party. Anyway, Lincoln's going to win because who's he running against? Peace Democrats and George McClellan. By the way, let's laugh at this. A general, George McClellan, is leading the peace Democrats. But it kind of makes sense when we realize that McClellan wasn't good at actually attacking, right? So anyway, the war Democrats unite with the Republicans to make the Union Party, and the Union Party nominates Lincoln for president in 1864. The peace Democrats nominate McClellan. Abe wins and the South is upset, and then morale takes another hit. They wanted McClellan. The South wanted McClellan because they knew Abe wouldn't stop until he won. They knew Lincoln wouldn't stop until he conquered. The South ultimately was hoping for McClellan, and Lincoln's like, yeah, we can convince this guy. We can, maybe McClellan, because he wants peace, will stop fighting us, right? Maybe, so Southerners are really upset, and then morale takes another hit. Now, we kind of have a plan. Grant brought us that plan of just total war, right? So let's see the action. Okay, Grant pursues Lee. Okay? Grant had almost twice as many troops as Lee and would use that to his advantage. Grant and Lee first met at the Battle of the Wilderness. Both sides lose many men, but the South has few replacements. Remember, Grant has way more troops than Lee. Both sides lose many men, but the South has few replacements. Even more important is that Grant doesn't stop. Unlike others, he doesn't rest and let Lee get away. He just pushes on. So, Battle of Wilderness, Lee starts to retreat. Well, Grant follows him. Grant is not going to let up. He is going to chase Lee until Lee surrenders. That's the whole point. Never backing up, never retreating. Okay? Both sides lose many men, but the South has few replacements. Even more important, Grant doesn't stop. Unlike others, he doesn't rest and let Lee get away. He just pushes on. Then they meet again at Cold Harbor, and the Union lost many men again. But Grant refuses to let up. He said the Union will never retreat. Finally, we get a stalemate for 9 months. Okay? So, y'all, Battle of Wilderness, Grant keeps going. Battle of Cold Harbor, Grant keeps going. But we're going to finally get a stalemate where neither side is making much change for about 9 months. That brings us back to the South and the West. Remember, Grant and Sherman were out west. Well, that west starts to transition over to the east along the south, right? So, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, then down to Shiloh, right? Shiloh's bottom of Tennessee, southwest Tennessee. So what's he going to do? He starts to move, Grant starts to move east towards Chattanooga, right? More towards central in East Tennessee. Now, Sherman is going to take over after Chattanooga and continue going east, going towards the Atlantic coast. Okay? So, Sherman's march. After Chattanooga, William Tecumseh Sherman led his army east towards the Atlantic coast. Okay? Let me pause just for a second. Alright, sorry about that, y'all. I had to pause. So, after Chattanooga, William Sherman led his army east towards the Atlantic coast. So again, what we're seeing is that now Sherman is in control in the west. He's moving across the south. He's going east. So after Chattanooga, Sherman led his Union army east towards the Atlantic coast. His opponents retreated, and at first, his opponents retreated at first, but then decided to fight. But Sherman's army was too strong. He encircled and captured Atlanta, Georgia, then continued east. His goal was to decimate the South in every way possible. Now, he wanted to ruin, exhaust, and humble the South. That's what Sherman is ultimately looking to do. Wanted to ruin, exhaust, and humble the South. Decimate them in every way possible. So, Sherman is moving east from Chattanooga. He then moves to the Atlantic coast. Y'all, the second he sets foot, he's trying to get to the Atlantic coast. The second he sets foot in Georgia, basically, he makes a decision to destroy everything. This is what is known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Where his army is at, until he gets to the Atlantic coast, his decision is to destroy everything he sees. Everything, if his army can't use it, he's going to destroy it. Because he wants to make sure that the Confederate army can't use it against him. And more importantly, going back to what Grant was doing, kill the morale of the South. Even if you hurt some civilians and you hurt some civilian crops along the way, so be it. Make it to the point where the South doesn't want to fight you. Not that they can't fight you, but that they don't want to fight you anymore. So he encircled and captured Atlanta, Georgia, then continued east. What he couldn't use, he destroyed. He went down to Savannah and then up into South Carolina. So his idea is, he goes from Atlanta, he goes down to Savannah, Georgia. He goes east, going to Savannah, Georgia. Then he starts working his way up the coast, eventually getting into South Carolina, in particular going to Columbia, South Carolina. Okay? So, the end is upon us. In March of 1865, Lincoln had his second inauguration. He was the first president to be reelected since Andrew Jackson. Let's think about that for a second, y'all. Jackson wins his first election in 1828, or he wins his first presidential election here in 1828, and then he gets reelected in 1832. Yo, it's not until 1864 that we see any president get reelected, whether it's because they died in office or it's because they just weren't reelected. No, He's the first president to get reelected since Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. In his speech, Lincoln expressed his hope for an end to the war with, quote, a just and lasting peace. He said that reconciliation must be pursued with, quote, malice toward none, with charity for all. So you hear Lincoln talking here at the end of, towards the end of the Civil War, during his second inauguration, about trying to get an end to this war without it being crazy, without everyone, without there being a lot of payback, in essence, without a lot of retribution. A just and lasting peace. Yo, think about it. When you get punished too hard, when somebody retaliates to you too much, you kind of get bitter, right? Like, your parents punish you too hard. You harbor that. You hold that against them for a long time. Lincoln doesn't want that to happen with the South. South needs to be punished. But we need it to be just. We need it to be fair, because if it's not fair on either side, the peace isn't going to last. With malice toward none, with charity for all, understanding that this is a war, in essence, but a war that divided the nation. We need to find a way to not be angry with one another. We need to be charitable for all. Even though we were just fighting these people, no matter which side you're on, even though I was just fighting that person, I have to have some level of charity, some level of sympathy for people on the other side. Okay? So, a just and lasting peace with malice toward none, with charity for all, is what Lincoln tells us in his second inauguration. That represented, those two quotes represented his idea for a post-war nation. One that focused more on reuniting than on obtaining revenge. So again, Lincoln's focused more on how can we put the nation back together. Remember, as soon as Lincoln took office, his number one thing was he didn't care as much about slavery. He cared more about reuniting the Union. How can we bring the Union back together? How can I stop secession? How can we bring the Union back together? That was Lincoln's ultimate goal. Slavery, when he took office in 1861, remember, he had no intention of interfering with it where it already existed. He just didn't want to see it spread. Then, as the war goes on, and he recognizes that there's no way this war is going to end without ending slavery, he recognizes that, hey, look, we have to end slavery. He brings out the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's when we move forward. So now, how's the war actually going to end? In early April, after being in a stalemate for months, the Confederates were losing hope and supplies. So in early April 1865, the Confederates were losing hope and supplies. Robert E. Lee decided to leave Richmond and head south to unite with other Confederates. But Grant blocked his escape route. Now Lee decided to surrender to save what lives he had left. So what we're seeing is that ultimately Lee is trying to unite with other Confederate generals. He tries to escape. Grant blocks it. And now what happens? Lee recognizes, hey, I need to do something. So on April 9th, 1865, at the Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. Grant allowed for an honorable surrender of the Southern soldiers. He didn't parade his victory at their cost. Grant could have come in, riding on his horse and being all fancy and like literally paraded his men up to the gate and forced Robert E. Lee to like lay down his sword at Grant's feet and all this stuff. But Grant didn't do that. Again, going back to what Lincoln said, a just and lasting peace is very civil, very, hey, look, you're on that side, you're on that side. Lee surrenders his army, says we will not fight anymore. Grant accepts, and they go on about their day. He doesn't make a big parade about it, okay? So Grant allowed for an honorable surrender of the Southern soldiers. Again, recognizing, the South recognizes here that they've lost. There's no need to, in essence, there's no need to be, we know what it's like to be a poor loser, but there's also this idea of being a poor winner, being a gloat, and ultimately Grant avoids that. The Confederate forces in the South and elsewhere all surrendered by the end of May, so the war is finally over. So Lee surrenders here April 9th, 1865. That is the biggest portion of the Confederate Army, but any other Confederate Army out there, any other Confederate soldiers out there are all going to surrender by the end of May in 1865, and the war is finally over. So what are our conclusions? 1 out of every 12 men in the nation served. 1 out of every 12. That's a huge number. Think about it. We all know people, or we know somebody who knows somebody who's in the military, right? But think about a scenario like, do you, 1 out of every 12, if you think about how many people you know and how many people serve in the military, you think it's 1 out of 12? It's a huge number. It really is. Over 630,000 men die. Over 630,000 men die. And then new weapons, y'all. We see a lot of new weapons here. Rifle barrel guns really start to make progress. We also see ironclad ships, as well as observation balloons. We start to see basically hot air balloons that are going to be used to see where the enemy is at. So we start to see some new weapons: rifle barrel guns, ironclad ships, and observation balloons. And that wraps up. Chapter 17 for us, and we will look at chapter 18 in the next video.